you so much for coming out. I want to back up, support something that Barry just said, because quite often people in politics and the media that cover them get bogged down in covering people's interests. You know, this group wants this or that and has this much power or that much power to achieve it and that kind of thing. So this series of 3 debates will focus on principles. What do people who believe they are working for the greatest good, and I hope we're not all so cynical that we don't believe people in public life actually most of the time think they are working for the greatest good, but in a free society actually believe. How do policy positions from health reform to war flow from those core beliefs, and how much can we really separate abstract beliefs from the interests of the people who believe them? Hopefully over the course of these 3 events we will help everyone who watches to and listens and reads these words, and hello to people watching us on live streaming video wherever you are right now. Hopefully people will come closer to an understanding of your own first principles or sharpen your opinions after hearing our debaters lay out their cases. Demos and the Ayn Rand Institute are very far apart in where they come down, really very far apart. And as someone who does a lot of common groundwork on my shows, I will say that this kind of debate is not the only way to get at a principled truth. But it is one way, and with our smart and informed debaters, I think we will have a very good time. And you will find yourselves rooting for one or another a lot of the time, and maybe you'll decide that you're somewhere in the middle on some things. Either way, it is for the good, and I think we will all learn something in the process. DEMOS, for those of you who don't know, is a nonpartisan national public policy organization based here in New York that works to advance the common good through research and advocacy. It has offices in Washington and Boston as well, and is also publisher of the liberal magazine American Prospect. That by their own description, and the description of Ayn Rand Institute says headquartered in Irvine, California. They work to introduce young people to Rand's novels, to support scholarship and research based on her ideas, and to promote the principles of reason, rational self-interest, individual rights, and laissez-faire capitalism to the widest possible audience. Please welcome our debaters to the stage. Come on out, guys. Miles Rappaport has been president of DEMOS since 2001. Prior to that, he spent 15 years in Connecticut politics. He served for 10 years in the legislature and was Connecticut Secretary of State from 95 to 98. In that office, he was an energetic advocate for a democracy with efforts for voter registration, campaign finance reform, and 2 unique reports on the state of democracy in Connecticut. Dr. Yaron Brook is a prominent advocate for objectivism, the philosophy of Rand, and president of the Rand Institute. His talk, Why Conservatives Are Anti-Business, challenges the common notion that conservatives are allies of business and capitalism. He was born and raised in Israel. In 1987, he moved to the United States, became an American citizen in 2003. In 1998, he co-founded a financial advisory firm, BH Equity Research, at which he is presently managing director and chairman. And he is co-author of the book, Neoconservatism, An Obituary for an Idea, the only book I know that has been reviewed positively by both Tom Hartman from Air America and Glenn Beck. Please again welcome Miles and Yaron. Now, in your program, you'll notice this insert plugging the next event in the series, and at the bottom is a black and white square that looks computery. That's a QR tag. You can use your smartphone, and it will direct you to a page at itsafreecountry.org where the conversation about freedom, our next topic, has already begun with videos and links and a haiku contest. If you don't know how to use a QR tag, find someone under 30 to help you. And if you can't do that, just go to itsafreecountry.org and we lay it out. Now, how many of you went to itsafreecountry.org and took the 20-question proper role of government poll on the site? No? Who were all those people? Well, let me give you some of the results that I think are pretty interesting and might preview a little bit of what we'll hear tonight. We had approximately 475 responses, and I won't go through all 20 questions, but a few that I think are revealing. Which would you include as a proper role of government was the overarching question. Protect and defend the U.S. homeland militarily if necessary, 99% said yes. Protect and defend national economic interests abroad militarily if necessary, that split exactly 50-50. Support democracy abroad, even if a democratic electorate is hostile to us, 71% said no. Prescribe who may get married, is that the proper role of government? 91% said no. So a little confluence between liberals and objectivists, at very least. Provide free public education to youth through high school, 55% yes, but 45% said no. Free public education through high school is not the role of government, and I think that's you objectivists, right? Then provide senior citizens a minimal level of income to provide basic needs. Again, 52% said yes, the rest said no. Provide all citizens a minimal level of income to cover basic needs, 61% no. Provide health insurance for children and senior citizens, 50-50. And finally, a couple of others, protect the public health by regulating drugs, environmental pollution, and food production. We got a 59% yes on that, which I think indicates a little more sympathy on the part of objectivists than some of the other things like Social Security. Tell the private sector that it may not discriminate on the basis of race or sex. Just 53% said yes. And finally, establish rules that protect children from graphic media content. 63% said no. So a fair number of liberals don't like that either. We did ask people how they identified politically. 42% said liberal or progressive. 47% said conservative or libertarian or objectivist. And I apologize to the objectivists because I realize now that objectivists object to being lumped with conservatives. And 11% said other. Now, just so our debaters know who's here tonight, how many of you would describe yourselves as mostly philosophically aligned with Rand? Okay. Nice turnout, you guys. Nice turnout. How many of you would describe yourselves mostly as liberal or progressive? You know, we specialize in putting people who disagree in the same room at It's a Free Country and WNYC, and I think by that measure we've already been a success. If anyone raised your hand in both categories, raise your hand again. And if anyone considers yourself neither mostly liberal or mostly like Ayn Rand, raise your hand. Okay. The independent, we have to get you to speak at some point and tell us who you are. All right, now it's time to hear from our debaters. The format is they will each speak for about 10 minutes. We're running a clock, so I'm going to cut them off at 10 minutes. Then I will moderate a follow-up conversation for about a half an hour, and then we'll come back to you all for follow-up questions. And let me ask you in advance when we get to that point not to make speeches, but really to raise first principles and challenge one or both of the speakers to defend or to clarify or to expand. Let's keep this at a really high level. So, we didn't toss a coin, but by consensus, so it's a good start. We decided that Miles Rappaport will go first. Miles.
Thank you. I want to start by making a few thank yous of my own. First, thank all of you for coming. I think it's heartening that there's an appetite for this kind of serious and thoughtful debate. And I thank Yaron and the Ayn Rand Institute for being really good partners in putting this together. Great thanks to Brian Lehrer for agreeing to host and to WNYC. I want to thank my colleagues, particularly David Callahan and Ginny Canduccia, who really put a lot of work into making this happen. And I also want to thank Robert Schulman, who manages somehow to be a friend of both Demos and the Ayn Rand Institute, and gracefully so. So this was his excellent idea, and we're delighted to be here. I also think this is a really important moment to be having this debate. I think we are entering a new period in modern American political history, dating back to World War II. I think between World War II and probably the mid-1970s, there was a kind of a liberal consensus that included support for expansion by corporations, a strong role for unions, an active role for government, and a belief that together, all those parts of society could really solve problems. I think since 1980, the ideas of Ronald Reagan have in general been the dominant ideas to reduce taxes, reduce the size and scope of government, more power, and give more power to the free market. From my point of view, those ideas applied in serious governance have driven the country into a ditch and almost off a cliff. But I think right now we are entering a new period, and the character of that period is not yet defined. We're at a moment where fundamental decisions about our country's direction need to be made, and in a moment like this, it's critically important for us to understand and articulate our first principles. At Demos, we're clear on what those first principles are. We want a society and an economy where economic growth is encouraged, where economic opportunity and the benefits of economic growth are widely shared, where the economic insecurity that so many people in the middle class are experiencing is lessened, and where economic inequality, now at its highest level since 1928 and perhaps since 1913, is reduced. We also want a democracy where everyone is encouraged to participate, where barriers to participation are lowered, and we have high levels of registration and voting, high levels of civic and community engagement, and where all voices are heard and none are drowned out by the power of money. In order to have that kind of economy and that kind of democracy, we believe that we need a strong, robust public sector with the ability to solve problems, plan for the future, create and maintain the public structures and fair rules of the road that all of us, businesses, individuals, and communities need in order to succeed. At Demos, we believe in that. We're working toward it, and we're prepared to argue for it. It is possible, by the way, to have this debate at too high of a philosophical level, divorced from the real decisions and the real public debates. So I think we have to do both. I think we have to argue it based on our first principles and also as relevant to the public debates that we're having. I think our principles need to be grounded in the reality of how they're applied and in the historical and philosophical underpinnings. And for us, we believe ours do. Philosophically, Demos's views derive from the earliest writings on democratic society, when the notion of a social contract was created. In order to have a community or a society, individuals voluntarily surrender some of their absolute ability to do whatever they please in return for a common entity that creates a common good and allows thereby each of them to live in a better and more fulfilling way. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, one of the people who wrote most compellingly on this, says, "Finally, each man in giving himself to all gives himself to nobody. And as there is not an associate over whom he does not acquire the same rights as he yields others over himself, he gains an equivalent for everything he loses and an increase in force for the preservation of what he has." The passage from the state of nature to the civil state produces a very remarkable change in man by substituting justice for instinct in his conduct and giving his actions the morality they had formerly lacked. We fundamentally believe that the first thing that we need to do is envision the kind of society that we want to create together and for which we're willing to enter into a common purpose. Again, for Demos, some of the aspects of this society, the kind of society we want to see, are clear. From early life, where options for education and good health and college and a future that has possibilities in it, for accessible and affordable health care, the opportunity to work and get fair wages, the need for safe communities and decent housing, the rule of law and physical security, and for old age, accessible, affordable health care, a secure retirement, and freedom from destitution. In short, a society where each individual not only has the negative freedom from coercion, but also a positive, affirmative freedom to truly achieve the pursuit of happiness with assistance from a supportive community. In pursuit of this kind of society, there are two different, very complementary roles that government needs to play. The first is to protect individuals as they pursue their lives in happiness. And I think in and around this area is probably where Yaron and I have the most areas of agreement, and some of it was in the poll. But in addition, we don't want people mugging each other or stealing from each other, and we all know that we need cops on the beat. On that, we're agreed. But there are many other things that I would argue are interferences with the ability to pursue happiness. When a mortgage broker persuades an unsuspecting home buyer to take a mortgage he knows will fail and is paid on the basis of the spread between what that mortgage holder could get in a mortgage and what he was able to persuade them to buy, we need a government agency that's prepared to stop that. You're taking my time, don't do that. When a company dumps toxic waste into a river or the ground behind a plant because it is cheaper to do that than to safely dispose of it, we need an EPA to stop that. When a company maintains unsafe factories or mines because worker protections are too costly and dozens of miners die unnecessarily, we need a government agency, an OSHA or a minerals management service with the strength and integrity to stop it. When workers are intimidated from organizing and speaking up on their own behalf in the workplace, we need an NLRB that works to ensure fair elections. When banks and credit card companies offer deceptive coupons to trap consumers in predatory contracts with interest rates that can be as high as 30%, we sure as heck need a Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to stop it, and thank God we're now going to get one. Finally, I'll go one step further. When we have an economy that produces the chasm of inequality we have now, with a tiny group of people on the top having huge jumps in their income over the last 20 years, while the bottom 80% of the population have had an income that is stagnant or has declined, we need a government that will use its taxing power to even the scale just a little bit. The second critical role for government, in addition to protecting people against those kinds of the negative consequences of unrestrained capitalism, we need a second role for government, which is an affirmative role, which is to create the conditions for people to have an improved quality of life, a chance for the real pursuit of happiness. Here, a historical point. The crowning achievement of America in the post-World War II period was the creation of a growing, thriving, rising middle class. One can argue it was, in fact, the most potent reason for the fact that the United States won the Cold War, persuading people around the world that our system could really produce for everyone. But this was not an accident, and certainly not the result of an unfettered free market. There were enormous government investments and government policies that set out to create a middle class, and they succeeded. There were major investments in computer technology. While Al Gore did not invent the internet, the government sure as heck did. The Advanced Research Projects Agency of the Defense Department created the internet and allowed all of the commercial development of it to emanate from that. There were massive investments in the American university system, including public universities, that made the American university system the envy of the world, if we don't undermine it in the next few years by budgetary neglect. And there were investments in people directly. The GI Bill allowed millions of returning veterans to go to college and buy a home. Pell Grants and loans, which used to cover 70% of a college education and now cover only 30%, made college education affordable to a whole generation of students who didn't come from wealthy backgrounds. Social Security and Medicare, far from being welfare programs for the undeserved, made a base income and health care a basic right for millions of elderly people whose lives would have been impossible otherwise. To a far greater degree than we do today, our nation adopted the idea of a real social contract. Productivity increased, incomes of working people increased along with them, labor unions ensured fair treatment of workers on the job, the middle class grew, and inequality decreased, all up through the mid-1970s. And it is inescapable that it was government policy, government investment, and a willingness not to be ruled by the private sector alone is what made that creation of a middle class possible. And for the last 2 years, 30 years, we have been going backwards, and the middle class is truly an endangered species today. As a country, today, we have a choice to make. In the name of lower taxes, limited government, and increased freedom for the free market, we are in danger of destroying the middle class and shredding the social contract that made us so successful. We risk becoming a country with a small sliver of highly successful people, the plutonomy, as Goldman Sachs describes it, and a substantial majority of people with low education, inadequate health care, insecure incomes, and unnervingly dim prospects for old age, and an income distribution that looks a lot like a poor third world country. The question I have is whether that is the future we want for ourselves, and if the answer is no, then we have to have a government as efficient, as honest, as thoughtfully structured as we can make it, but a government that has the power, the resources, and the public support it needs to do its job. That's the path that we at Demos want to argue for, and I believe in substance the people of this country agree. So let's get on with it.
Thank you as well. Thank you, Brian and WNYC for co-hosting these events, and for Demos for being a really wonderful partner and helping do a lot of the logistics that have made this event, I think, a success. And of course, my staff at the Ayn Rand Institute that I think has put in many, many hours in trying to get all you guys here and in making these events possible. And of course, Bob Schulman, without whose assistance that this was possible and he could get these two groups together to make it happen, these events would not have happened. As Brian mentioned, I immigrated to this country. I came here from Israel. Why? What is it that makes this country special? What is it that makes this country different? What is it that I identified as a reason to come to this country? Well, I think you have to go back to the source. You have to go back to the founding of this country, because the founding is not an accident. The founding is a real revolution. It's not just a revolution of arms, but the founding of this country is a fundamental, historical, moral, political revolution, an ideological revolution. The founders, following from the work of John Locke and the Scottish and English Enlightenment, the founding fathers identified a principle that said, that asked, the question was, who does your life belong to? Who does the individual's life belong to? And the answer, historically, forever, really, had always been, your life belongs to the tribe, it belongs to the king, it belongs to the state, it belongs to the pope, it belongs to some group outside of the individual. And both the Enlightenment thinkers, culminating with the founders, said, no, that's not true. Your life belongs to you. It belongs to you morally, and it belongs to you politically. So they rejected the notion of collectivism. They rejected the notion that you as an individual owe your primary duty to some entity external of you. And they said you have a right to pursue your own life, to make the most of your life, to pursue your happiness, not maximize social utility. It's not in the Declaration. It's not to sacrifice to your neighbor, but to live your life. And that is the revolution. That's what makes America different than any other country and any other society. It was founded on a moral principle, the principle of individualism, the principle that says that your life is yours to be lived, to pursue the values that you think are good for you. Now, what does this imply for government? Well, if your life belongs to you, then what role does the government have? And again, I think the Enlightenment and Rand further develops this notion that the one impediment to the rational individual, to the individual guided by reason, to pursue his own values, to pursue his own happiness, to pursue his own life, the one barrier to that is force, is the initiation of force, is the fist, is the gun, is the fraudster, is the crook, is the criminal. And government's role is to stop those people, to protect us from the initiation of force, to allow us to be free, to allow us to pursue those values necessary for our survival, for our existence, for our happiness, for our success. And, the concept that identifies both these notions is the concept of individual rights. It's the idea that government is there to protect individual rights, to protect the right of individuals to pursue their life, to protect it from the use of force. From the use of force by his neighbor, from the use of force of other people within society. And that's it. It's to protect your moral right to live your life as you rationally see fit, to pursue your values. Now, we have to recognize here that government is force. Government is a gun, always has been. Everything government does, the difference between government and a debate like this, the difference between government and a business, is that government has a gun. If you don't do what government says, you go to jail. Somebody shows up with a badge and a gun and drags you off to jail. That's the essential nature of government. And the founders understood that what we need to do with government is, yeah, it's about force, but that force should only be used because of the, if you will, the evil nature of the initiation of force, the harmful effect of forcing people to do things they don't want to do. Government should only use that force as a retaliator, as a protector, as a defender of rights, and never use that force in initiation. So government should have a police force that protects us common criminals. It should have a military in order to protect us from foreign invasion. And it should have a judiciary to arbitrate, objectively arbitrate, disputes that might arise and to dish out justice as a follow-on to the police powers. But that's it. As an entity of retaliatory force, that's all it needs to do. And indeed, if it does anything else, then it is moving from using force as a retaliator to using force as an initiator of that force. And Miles gave us a long list of examples where government would advocate for government to use force in order to provide the kind of services, the kind of products, the kind of goodies that he believes government should provide. So government will tell us what kind of mortgage contracts are okay for us to engage in. We're not free to go in and negotiate whatever we think. We might be mistaken, we might be right, we may be wrong, but assuming fraud is out of this, because I think we both agree that fraud is a violation of rights, fraud is a form of force, we are not, according to the argument made, we're not free to negotiate whatever makes sense in terms of a mortgage. Government is going to tell us what mortgage to have. And what does it mean when government tells us what mortgage we're going to have? It means government is going to force us. And it means if we don't do exactly what government's going to say, we're going to be dragged off to somewhere. The gun comes out. Government is force. How are we going to get this greater equality of wealth? Well, some people who produce wealth, somebody's going to show up at their door with the equivalent of a gun, and some of their wealth is going to be taken from them by force and given to somebody else. Force. And how do we justify all this use of force? And you can go, healthcare and across. How do we justify this use of force? Well, we justify it by saying, the majority wants it. 51% voted to take from this guy, take from Joe, and give to Sam. So theft, we all agree, is bad. Unless, somehow magically, by voting, we make it okay. But I would argue that force, initiation of force, and theft are bad. No matter if it's done by an individual, as Miles said, you're just taking up time. No matter whether it's done by the individual, or whether it's done by the mafia, or whether it's done by democratic vote. We all, and this debate is a testament to free speech and the idea of free speech and very, very opposing points of view. And in democratic Athens, right, when Socrates dared to confront the youth of Athens with ideas that were challenging democracy, the elders of Athens got together and voted. And 51, 52, who knows what percent. But a clear majority, decided to silence Socrates by killing him. That's what majority rule. That's what happens when you allow force, when you allow the initiation of force by the group over the individual. Then a case like Socrates is going to happen, and indeed, maybe not so much in free speech today in America, but it's certainly in terms of property, certainly in terms of most of our liberties, that is exactly what's happening today. So we do, I agree with Miles, we do face a crossroads. I disagree with the historical analysis leading to the crossroads, but we certainly seem to be facing a crossroads today. The question, I think, is, do we want a government that is coercive, or do we want a government that is protective of our rights? Thank you.
So, Yaron, to follow up on what you were just saying about the force of majority rule, would you say that as a matter of first principles for you, individual sovereignty trumps democracy? Is democracy a first principle for you in some way?
No. But let me be clear what I mean by democracy. If what we mean by democracy is majority rule, then no. And indeed, I think here I agree with Madison and Jefferson, who very much opposed democracy and wrote extensively on its dangers. I believe in a strong constitution, a republic with a constitution, where the rights, each individual's rights, cannot be violated no matter what the majority says. So your right to property, you should be able to do whatever you want with property, no matter what your neighbors think, no matter how much they vote. The same would be true of speech. The same would be true of all individual rights. So yes, those individual rights supersede democracy. I think that was the basis on which this country was founded. This was not founded as a democracy. This was founded as a constitution-based, rights-respecting republic. And I agree with the founders on that.
Miles, go ahead and respond. I'd like to respond too.
I'm a little loath to try to make arguments that stand or fall on whether some piece of what the founders have written is to your liking, because the founders had many disagreements. The Declaration of Independence was originally supposed to be life, liberty, and property, but it ended up as life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. I would argue that the distinction between those two things is an indicator that there is a more affirmative approach to the idea of government that was present among the founders as well. The preamble of the Constitution, just to take a document at random, said that government's purpose, I want you to compare this to what Yaron just said was government's purpose. Government's purpose is to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Now, that sounds like a pretty big job to me if you're really going to try to do it all, and I think the founders understood that there was a lot more to making a country work and to making a society work and to allow people to pursue happiness than simply protecting them from individualized force against each other. And to bring it to the modern day, I guess I want to go back a little bit to the point I made before. The imagery that the only thing that one ought to be prevented from doing is doing physical harm or fraud harm, which is a very broad term, to other people, it's a very narrow view. I think there are many other elements in our culture, in our society, in our economy that do harm to people. And therefore, it is the responsibility of government, whether that harm is poverty, whether that harm is sickness, whether that harm is unequal access to education. It is the responsibility of government in creating a more perfect union, in promoting the general welfare, to do something about that, and not to sit back and say, well, that's how the free market has distributed happiness. So we're just going to allow that to happen. I think it's the government role to make sure that people have a genuine ability to pursue happiness, and that means everybody, not just the people on the top.
Yaron, I just want to follow up on your notion that democracy is not first principle, because for a lot of people, they're going to think you went off the rails completely already. Democracy is not a first principle? I mean, I know what you said about individuals, but how do we get to a society in the modern day with broad satisfaction without democracy, and how can we not care about democracy?
Well, I think quite the contrary. I think the broad dissatisfaction that we have today is to a large extent the consequence of democracy and the notions that the majority can force the minority, in this case the only real minority, which is the individual, to do what he does not want to do, to live a life that is not by his choosing. So I would question the idea that satisfaction comes from giving up your life to some anonymous group of voters. I think quite the contrary. I think that we would have a much happier, a much more successful, a much more prosperous, a much better, a much healthier, better savings for retirement, all the stuff that Miles really wants. I mean, in terms of outcomes, all of that, with maybe the exception of equality, would result to a much greater extent with freedom and individualism. But let me go back to the fundamental point here. The fundamental question is, does your life belong to you? Or does your life belong to a group? And then it's if it belongs to the group, then it's a technicality. Is that group represented by a king? Or is that group represented by a council? Is the council voted? It's not yours. And I'm arguing that my life is mine. You know, that my moral responsibility is to my life. Every one of our moral responsibilities is to live our lives the best that we can for ourselves. And that giving that up is abdication of our most sacred responsibility.
Before we move on to some other points, Miles, do you want to advocate for democracy?
Yes,
literally?
I think I will. I'll accept the premise that Yaron just said, that fundamentally one's life is one's own responsibility, etc. However, I do think that no man and no woman is an island. Individuals exist in a family, they exist in a neighborhood, they exist in a community, and the decisions that people make affect other people almost all the time. It's almost an impossibility to say, I can do exactly what I want on my property as long as I don't bother anybody else. But whether it's, you know, burning leaves on your lawn that pollute the entire neighborhood, or dumping toxic waste in your backyard, or making so much noise that nobody on your block can sleep. There are ways in which people affect other people, and that needs to be taken into account.
Sure,
I would say
on
the democracy question. So I just think it's an absolute statement that doesn't really correspond to reality in an interdependent community and an interdependent world. I would say in terms of democracy, it is completely true that total and unimpeded majority rule can have negative consequences, and so we have in our society the Constitution, a Bill of Rights. There are certain rights that are protected and cannot be dismantled by majority vote. But fundamentally, in terms of the best decisions over a period of time, having those decisions made by a democratic sentiment, by democratic elections, by the will of the people, has got to be better than any other. It's the worst form of government, except for any other form that's been invented. And I would argue that the problems that we are having come when democracy is distorted, whether by money, whether by the fact that some people are prevented from voting. Those kinds of things. I think the more democracy we have, the more full democracy we have of people, of individuals, the better off we'll be.
Yaron, I don't want to go around in circles, so just take 30 seconds if you want to
Yeah,
follow
just
up.
about this interconnectedness. Yeah, I mean, we're better off living in a society. We benefit enormously from the productive ability of other people. And the mechanism by which we should relate to those people is through the voluntary mechanism of trade. Trade is a win-win. Both parties benefit. It's voluntary. And all the things about pollution and so on. Again, you can't dump garbage in my backyard. I mean, I think we agree on that. You know, that's a violation of rights, and that's what the government is indeed there to protect from.
So Miles said in his opening statement that a first principle is to achieve a nation with some shared values, some common purpose. Is that not a first principle for you?
No. Well, the common purpose is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That would be this notion that reason is going to guide our life, that we're going to guide our own life, and we're not going to violate other people's rights, and other people are not going to violate our own.
All right. Now, Miles, Yaron said a minute ago, we agree on some things except equality. You wrote in your blog post leading up to the event on It's a Free Country that America's signal achievement is a broadly shared prosperity and a middle-class society. Is having that as a goal a first principle for you?
Yes, it is a first principle. I think that fundamentally there needs to be the ability for all of the citizens, all of the people in the society, to have a real, genuine, fair chance to succeed. The market distributes goods very efficiently under certain circumstances, but completely inefficiently under other circumstances. And the circumstances are when wealth is so badly distributed that therefore Joe Smith's billionaire's desire for a seventh Mercedes is stronger in the marketplace than Mrs. Jones's ability to feed their children because she doesn't have money. You cannot say that that is a rational set of outcomes. We ought to be comfortable about it. And that's not people relating by trade. Trade is an interesting term that connotes two equal partners. But in our society, in commerce, in the marketplace, we don't have equal partners. Sometimes we do, many times we don't. It is government's role to make sure that those partnerships are somewhat equalized. I think that's a fundamental first principle. Our society risks going down the path of a third world country if we reject that and don't think it's important.
Miles, take me just a little bit further. Some shoring up of the bottom, Yaron might even disagree with that, but how much further do you go? How much equality? Because you wrote, broadly shared prosperity and a middle-class society. How much equality is necessary for successful society?
Well, in the first 30 years after World War II, the gap, however you want to measure it, the Gini coefficient, the percent of wealth taken by the top 1%, was narrowing. And the middle class was growing. People were doing better. Incomes were rising. People had the expectation that their children would have a better life than they do. That is evaporating. Most people that I know, most people that in polling, think their children's lives will now be worse off than theirs. It's the first time that that's happened in a very long time. And the times when our society moved towards equality, moved towards more broadly shared prosperity, is when we've had an active government willing to intervene, willing to do things, willing to tax, willing to trust bust, willing to have environmental protections. And when we reject those, we sink back into a situation where the widening will guarantee to occur. What exactly is the number? What exactly should the Gini? We can argue that. But I certainly would argue that I think everyone would agree that a situation in which we have a tiny sliver of people who are doing fabulously well, whether they be hedge fund managers or the titans of industry that Ayn Rand wrote about, but other people are having more and more insecurity, less and less sense of confidence about their future, is an unacceptable situation, and we ought to fight really hard to change it.
So, Yaron, I know you'll disagree on how we get there, but I'm curious if you agree as a matter of first goals and first principles that, as Miles put it, America's signal achievement is or should be a broadly shared prosperity and a middle-class society.
I think that as a first principle, what you want is the freedom for anybody to achieve anything within their ability. That means the opportunity for poor people to rise up and make a fortune. So I do agree on this issue. I'll agree that what we have today is unsustainable, that what we have today, we've institutionalized the poor, and it's growing, that there's enormous economic uncertainty, and a vast majority of Americans are suffering under this burden, that wealth creation across the board is stagnating dramatically, that the poor used to get richer faster than they are today. All of that is true. But I blame it all on government, and I think the solution is to get government out of the way. So if you look, it's interesting. I wrote down that the idea that the middle class came about because of government policies, which I find bizarre. No, the middle class is a product of the Industrial Revolution. The middle class is a creation of capitalism. So before the Industrial Revolution, there were two classes of people. There were aristocrats who, by the use of force, primarily in Europe, gained certain amounts of wealth, and there were poor subsistence farmers, and that was it. And life expectancy was, well below 40, and life was miserable, very, very miserable. What the Industrial Revolution did is it tripled the population of Europe within 100 years. What it did was bring all those subsistence farmers into the cities where they could earn, where they could become middle class, where they could ultimately start sending their kids to school because they could afford to, where they could ultimately start cleaning up the world in which they live, in which they could start accumulating actual wealth and actual material possessions. It is the Industrial Revolution. It's that freedom that the Industrial Revolution created, the wealth that it created that made the middle class possible. And it got rid of the kind of poverty that you don't find in the United States today. But if you travel to Cambodia and if you travel to Africa, that's how everybody lived once upon a time. What got us out of that, and what's getting them out of it today, to the extent that it's allowed, is freedom, is capitalism, is leaving people alone to pursue their values and to build that kind of wealth. And all that's happened since the early part of the 19th century is that government has gotten in the way. It's gotten in the way of that wealth creation machine, that wealth creation energy that is inspired by freedom. And I just want one fact, one thing to remember about the 19th century America. Not only was this economy growing at the fastest rate in human history, it was the freest. I mean, there's never been a free country like I would like to see it, but it was the closest we've seen. Not only was it growing the fastest rate in human history, but it was absorbing the largest percentage immigration ever, and maybe since. We were absorbing the poor, the miserable, the incompetent, according to the papers of the day, the idiot, the stupid, and of Europe, right? And they were coming in, and there were jobs. There were jobs. There was so much wealth. There was so much freedom. There was so much creativity. And within 2 generations, we know that those people succeeded very well, not because of government, but because of their own hard work and ingenuity, because of the freedoms that they had.
Miles? It's an interesting history, but it leaves out a huge portion of it. I don't quarrel with the notion that the Industrial Revolution and the development of machinery and the development of manufacturing created great wealth. It also created great misery. If you read any of the histories of England in the 1830s and the 1840s, an urban proletariat was created as opposed to a rural serf population that was miserable, that was sick, that had very short lifespans, that had all kinds of social dysfunction. And it was only when the dynamism of capitalism was harnessed and managed and restrained, whether it was by labor unions or by child labor laws. I have an interesting quote that I found from the president of the American Bar Association in the early 1900s, denounced child labor laws as a communistic effort to nationalize children. I suppose you could take the Aron's argument and say, since everyone is in control of their life, if a 7-year-old child wants to go to work in a factory and work 16 hours and be paid pennies, that's his or her right to do. No, I don't believe it. It's exploitation, and it is the responsibility of government and other people to intervene so it doesn't happen. And it's not, by the way, when I'm just talking about the 1830s, in 1960, over 1/3 of the elderly people in the United States lived in poverty. Okay? That's before the flowering of Social Security, before Medicare, before all of the programs that Yaron thinks are so unnecessary. Now it's under 10% of the elderly population. If you think that 35% of the elderly population being poor, going down to 10% is not an important thing and is not based on the policies that government do, I think you're not looking at history. So I accept and I share that there's tremendous dynamism under capitalism, growth occurs, but the sharing of that prosperity, the ability of everyone to enjoy it, not just the tiny few that didn't create it by themselves, by the way. Wealth is created by a combination of capital and labor, and everybody knows it. They can't appropriate all that. They should not be allowed to.
Yeah, just for the fun of it, I'd like to take the child labor on. There's this mythology that capitalism created child labor, that in the Industrial Revolution, suddenly children started working. Now, how many of you have ever lived on a farm? What do children do on a farm, even to this day? They work. And in subsistence farming, they worked and died at an unbelievable rate. So whatever happened when they moved to cities, and I'm not saying it was pleasant, certainly the early years of capitalism were unpleasant years, was an enormous improvement over what they had in the farms. The reason child labor went away The reason child labor, just go to Indonesia and ask them today. They'd rather work in a factory for $1 a day than work in the farm because life in the farm is so horrible that they'd rather work in what we would consider unthinkable conditions in a factory. But why did child labor go away? Again, look at the facts. The facts are, the empirical evidence is, that child labor went away for two reasons. One, parents accumulated enough wealth to be able to send their kids to school. Very few parents want to send their kids to work when they have another option. Second, how many of you manage people? How many of you like to manage 7-year-olds? It's just not efficient to manage kids. The laws came, as they usually do, the laws came after the phenomena was already disappeared. Again, it's just not productive.
Would you repeal the child labor laws and let it exist around the edges in American workplaces?
Yes, I would. I would repeal child labor laws and let it exist around the edges. And by the way, I think it does. Again, go to any farm. Families are not condemned for working their kids in a farm environment. Indeed, they're often, it's considered a wonderful thing.
I would not repeal child labor laws, just for the record.
I was questioning for a second.
A related concept from, only somewhat related, I guess, but from your blog post, Yaron, where you basically said, and I am paraphrasing, but you said that merit will successfully distribute wealth to a degree that there won't be destitution. I'm not quoting exactly, but you seem to be getting at that idea. Is that a first principle?
Well, it's I think, yes, in the sense that I believe that's absolutely true, that I think that anybody who is productive, anybody who wants to find work will find work in a truly free society. I think free societies generate many more jobs than people available to fill those jobs, and I think history is full of examples of that, actually, current history, even things that are going on today. And I think that, again, the history suggests that as capital is deployed, labor becomes more productive, wages rise, and standard of living rise, so that even the people at the bottom, and there will always be people at the bottom, right? Not everybody's above average, even in Minnesota. So, there will be people at the bottom of distribution, but those people at the bottom of distribution will be so much better off than what they were 20 years ago and what they would be in an unfree society. Then poverty, as we understand today, would not be an issue. We wouldn't care. Again, when you compare the kind of poverty we have in America, and some people do live in awful conditions, with poverty in Cambodia, it's not on the same level.
But as a matter of first principles on the proper role of government, to whatever extent poverty did exist in that society, it would not be the proper role of government to marshal other people's resources to alleviate it at the lowest ranks?
No, again, and we always use nice words like marshal other people's resources. But I'd like to spell it out.
I did say
it's
other
never
people's
justified.
resources.
It's never justified to steal people's money and give it to somebody else. And again, I don't think the democratic process of 51% makes stealing anything different than what it truly is, and that is theft. I don't want it. Now, if I want to give money, and there is a place for charity, and there will be people who probably need charity, people who can't take care of themselves, or where something accidental has happened to them for whatever reason, and they are destitute. I think there is a role for charity in those cases, and I believe that free people pursuing their own rational self-interest in a society of freedom are incredibly generous people. I think that charity would take care of those cases where people couldn't take care of themselves.
Miles?
I don't think it will happen on its own, and I think that that using the term stealing to describe everything that a government does is a rhetoric that doesn't teach us anything. There are a set of things that we want in our society. Maybe some of us, maybe not all of us agree. I happen to think that providing everyone with a public education from K through 12, actually I think today it's K through 14, in order to have a successful life. I think having people have good prenatal and child care is important. I think people not having the inability to get medical care when they need it is important. All those things require resources. How does a society commit those resources? Well, you can allow everyone to use their own resources exactly as they see fit, regardless of how they collected them. Or you can say, no, there are certain things that we want to do as a country that are the right thing to do, and in order to do that, we need to collect taxes on a fair basis. What's a fair basis? I would argue that a progressive taxation system, one which is in fact based on people's ability to pay, which taxes people at the top end at a higher rate than people at the bottom end, is the fairest way to do it. It's not theft. It's efficient, humane, reasonable use of resources, and that's the only way that a society can function. It's not theft. It is civilization.
Can I digress into foreign policy for just a minute? I have a feeling that the two of you would agree on opposition to the Iraq War, but for different reasons. Am I right? Miles?
I haven't heard his reason yet, so
Well,
I can only speak for
right,
I'm an individual. I can only speak for myself. I opposed it.
all right, Yaron, why don't you kick that off?
I'll start. Yeah. I mean, I think that it was the wrong war, fought for the wrong reason at the wrong time. Saddam Hussein, in my view, did not pose the kind of existential threat to the United States post 9/11. I don't think he had anything to do with the enemy who struck us on 9/11. The enemy who struck us on 9/11, in my view, is an ideological enemy, an enemy that we've called Islamic totalitarianism. The people who are totalitarians in their philosophy of governance and use Islam to justify that totalitarianism. It's a prevalent ideology, unfortunately, in much of the Middle East. That was the enemy, and the target should have been chosen appropriately. Iraq was not ruled by an Islamic totalitarian regime. While there's some evidence that they supported some Islamic totalitarian groups, that evidence is weak, and there were bigger targets. So in my view, there were two countries that overwhelm everything else in terms of supporting this particular ideology that is hostile to the United States and wants to kill people in the United States. And those two countries, Saudi Arabia, which happens to be supposedly a friend of ours, yet is funding schools that preach hatred of the West and hatred of everything about us all over the world on a regular basis, and Iran. Iran in particular, because Iran is the only political manifestation of Islamic totalitarianism fully manifest in the Muslim world. It is a country that I believe declared war on the United States on November 4th, 1979, when they took our embassy hostage. It is a country that has killed Americans over and over the years in the Middle East and elsewhere when they could. And I believe then, I believe now that you have to do something with Afghanistan, but that the real source, ideological, spiritual, motivational, energy-wise, of this entire movement in the Middle East, and the only way to swing it away from that is the Iranian regime, and that should have been our target. And I think it should be today as well.
Does it get to a first principle of the use of government and the use of force?
Yeah, the first principle is this. The first principle is the role of government is to protect individual rights. When those individual rights are threatened, when Americans are killed, when American property is confiscated on massive scale, then it is the role of government to intervene to defend American life and property. And I think in the case of Iran, Iran has given us lots of reasons for us to intervene in that defense. Now, if they were just an ideology I didn't agree with, but they were not a threat to the United States and they didn't kill Americans, their problem, not mine.
You mentioned property. So going back to the question in the poll that was on the website, would you answer yes to whether it's the role of government to use the military to defend American economic interests?
I would be cautious in how I answer that question because how we define our economic interest is going to be very crucial. I do think there are some interests. I do think that the United States has a responsibility to the property rights of individuals and corporations, I know corporations are not popular on the left, that when their property is confiscated in mass, it is the role of the U.S. government to help protect that property, yes.
Miles, how much do you agree?
I think we're going to have a little bit of a role reversal here, because what I would say is that the war in Iraq and many of the subsequent events show that we ought to be very limited and very judicious in the application of American force to solve problems and to reshape governments in our own image. I think that the United States should have realized at the time that there was an international effort that was needed, that would have taken time to put together. But some people in the Bush administration, particularly, were so intent on reshaping the Middle East in the way that we wanted to see it, that they were going to go to war no matter what, whether there were weapons of mass destruction or not, whether there was critical American interest at stake or not. And I think this is an example where recognizing the limits of American power and American exceptionalism and realizing that we live in an interdependent world and need to function smartly, strategically with our allies and other countries would have been a lot smarter, and we'd be in a lot better shape
And what
today.
about the property or economy piece? The property piece of what Yaron said, or the economic interests piece?
I do think that the United States has and should have the ability, basically in trade policy, in economic policy, in world monetary policy, to advance a set of national interests.
Through the military in some cases? Through the military in some cases?
Including the military in some cases, but I would argue that they ought to be very limited and that our record of doing so in the last 60 years is pretty abysmal.
We agree on most of that. I agree. I mean, we should not have gone to the Middle East to reshape the Middle East.
I want to throw out one more concept before we bring in the audience, and that is the place of the modern corporation and where it fits into this discussion, because it's been framed mostly as individual versus government. In today's world, compared to Jefferson's world, say, Yaron, does corporate sovereignty risk usurping individual sovereignty differently from government, but also significantly, and so needs to be a third and separate part of a first principles equation, or no?
No, I mean, I think all corporations are extensions of individuals. They are particular nexus of contracts, we used to call it in finance. They're a particular set of contracts that voluntarily people have come together in order to set up this particular legal entity that does business in their name. And this is why it's so important for corporations, the managers of corporations, to be representatives of shareholders, because they are the owners. But they're not the only contractual holders. There are contracts that bind bondholders to certain terms and shareholders to certain terms and suppliers and employees and so on. And they're just an extension of the individual rights of the owners and of all these contractual relationships. There's nothing special about corporations except that they happen to be an incredibly efficient way of doing business. That's all.
Miles?
Well, they happen to be incredibly efficient in some cases. They can be incredibly rapacious, downright fraudulent in the case of Enron and a few others. But I would say this. I think this is another example where balance and reasonable understanding of how things need to work together is important. Corporations in current shareholder capitalism exist to do the best possible for their shareholders. And if you're an oil company, and if you're in Saudi Arabia, and if you're making money hand over fist, you don't have any problem with the fact that the Saudi government may be exporting Wahhabist terrorist ideas, or that they may be oppressing their own people, or anything, as long as the money keeps flowing. And I think that that's a responsibility for government to say, corporations produce great wealth for their shareholders, for their stockholders, for their executives these days in untold amounts. They don't necessarily produce the best results for their employees. They don't necessarily produce the best results in terms of externalities for the environment. They certainly shouldn't be making our foreign policy. And I think what we need is looking at corporations, recognizing them for the dynamic that they are, but putting restraints on their behavior, setting some fair rules of the road that says that they cannot, they can't violate child labor laws, they can't pollute the environment, they can't, do foreign policy work that is inimical to the interests of the United States. And you need a government with the capacity and ability to say, no, there is a broader set of societal interests, call it stakeholder capitalism, that the companies ought to be doing. And if they're not going to do it themselves, it is absolutely right for democratically created laws and regulations and agencies and government and taxes to do it for them.
I agree completely about the foreign policy. Corporations shouldn't be setting foreign policy. That's the role of government. But I do want to be critical in the sense of modern day of what we experience right now in terms of corporations. There is far too much involvement of corporations in government and in government in corporations. That is, there's far too much of what some people call crony capitalism. I like to call crony socialism, or however you want to turn it. But far too much of American business trying to manipulate the system for whatever niche. Now, but let's think about why that happens. And that happens because government is everywhere in their lives. Government indeed does regulate everything Miles just said. Every single little decision made in a corporation today is regulated by government. And as a consequence, corporations set up these whole political arms to go, and maybe it starts out to defend themselves, and unfortunately it often slips into trying to manipulate the system in their favor. And I like to use Microsoft as an example of this because the numbers are so stark. Before the antitrust lawsuit against Microsoft, which was, by the way, launched because they dared to offer a product for free, and hurt consumers, obviously, dramatically by doing that, they spent on lobbying in Washington exactly $0. They never thought about it. They were too busy creating wealth. They were too busy making a living. And after today, they're one of the biggest spenders in the country. They spend tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars a year on lobbying in Washington. When government is attacking you, you're going to create these entities to defend yourself. And unfortunately, and I'm critical of corporations when this happens, those entities often are then used to manipulate the system to try to benefit the corporation at the expense of a true free market.
But this didn't start with Microsoft. This is corporations and their impact on government has a long and rich history in this country, going back to Standard Oil, the railroad monopolies, and all the robber barons of the 19th century, who, managed to enrich themselves in gigantic ways with all kinds of negative social consequences. Have tried since then to rehabilitate their memories through the creation of foundations. Andrew Carnegie, by the way, was a strong supporter of an estate tax. Many of these people do believe that there is a responsibility for wealth to be shared and for other people other than the wealthiest to get a chance. But I would say that that when Yaron says that unfortunately corporations are forced to defend themselves when government is too intrusive, has it backwards. Corporations have always tried to manipulate government, capture the regulatory agencies, by state legislatures, and they need to be restrained, there need to be balanced, and they need to be countervailing forces that John Kenneth Galbraith wrote about that don't allow corporations to rule the roost in the way they like to. And they do today to a much larger degree than they should, and that's a problem that we need to solve.
Right. We have 3 people with microphones, I believe, work in the aisles. So raise your hand if you want to ask a question. Let me ask you again to please keep it brief and ideally have it wind up with a question. And forgive me for going like this, but the lights are right in my eyes when it comes to seeing people out there. So, all right, so somebody right in the back there. I'm going to give some free rein to people with the microphones to choose, folks. So I guess we have somebody right there, yes?
For Miles, should first principles apply to all mankind? So for equality, for example, should the American government work towards equality for all mankind? Any country, a woman trying to feed her children in Kansas, should they be treated any differently than a woman in Somalia?
I do believe that we live in an interdependent world, that there is some responsibility for the United States and other wealthy nations to care about the issues of world poverty, as do many of the top philanthropists in the country. So yes, I think that the interests of, in a global sense, reducing world poverty, increasing world health, increasing the ability for those societies to generate a middle class of their own is something that the United States ought to take seriously. I won't go as far as to argue that absolutely everything that the United States does for people in the United States, they also should do for the people in Somalia. But the basic fundamental principle of lifting up living standards all around the world, I think, is a first principle and should be.
I do think we should care about people in Somalia, and to the extent that we care, we should wish upon them the freedoms and the liberty and the capitalism and the wealth creation that has benefited those countries that have freed up their populations, respecting the right to property, respecting individual rights. That's how they will rise up from poverty, and we'll benefit from it, because then they'll be better trading partners, and our standard of living will go up with them.
All right, somebody on this side?
This question is directed to the president of Demos. One of your final comments was that the corporations like to use government power to enrich themselves. And my question is, why don't you see that the government power to be doing that kind of regulation is the very problem that we need to get rid of, rather than that corporations will try to use the power once it exists?
Well, I guess, no, it's a good question, but I guess I think that in the absence of government regulation or other democratic, with a small d, countervailing forces, corporations, businesses, individuals, left entirely to their own devices without rules of the road, will end us up with bad outcomes in which some people, a small group of people do extremely well, many other people are left by the side of the road. So I think that what needs to happen is that government does have to have the regulatory authority, the ability to do those kinds of rules, but needs to exercise it extremely carefully, extremely thoughtfully, and independently of the companies that they're trying to regulate. You have seen example after example after example where that has not happened, but we sure as hell ought to try.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously would argue the opposite, and I think the empirical evidence suggests that it is those regulations, it is those controls that create the problems, that create the messes, and that when people are left free, when corporations are divorced from government, when government, in a sense, is divorced from the economy, when it separates itself from the economy, the outcomes are far better. The prosperity and the wealth creation far exceed anybody's wildest imagination, and people prosper under those kinds of systems.
All right. Where's the microphone on this side? How about right down here? Yes, right on the aisle over here.
This is for Yaron. You said you would repeal child labor laws despite the, I think the word you said was unpleasant aspect that had at the beginning of the 19th century. I wonder if you'd also repeal the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments despite the unpleasant character of slavery, because in fact, I can think of no government action that reached deeper into the free market, twisted and turned around that marketplace, abolished plantation slavery, and actually forced a number of states to be members of the Union. And I would think consistently you might also then want to say that government has no role in abolishing slavery. After all, slaves were property.
Well, of course not. I mean, let's think this through, right? I said my founding principle here, right? The first principle is individual rights. Individuals, doesn't matter if they're green, yellow, blue, black, white, red, they have individual rights. I said that the government cannot use force coercively, and that nobody is allowed to use force coercively. I can't use force against you. Indeed, I would flip this over on you. I would say that once you allow government to use force in the name of democracy, or in the name of the majority, or in the name of anything, then if the majority decides to enslave, as they did, to enslave Jews, or to enslave yellow people, or to enslave blacks, or whatever, is that okay? Since majorities are right. I stand for the individual, no matter what his color is, and against the use of force against him. And this is where some libertarians would object to what I'm going to say. I believe the Civil War was a just war because there was a contradiction in the founding of the country. It declared the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and yet it excluded a whole population. And the only right that exists, and this is the conservatives in the audience, is individual rights. There's no such thing as state rights. You can't have a state violating individual rights, and that's okay. And the role of the federal government is to protect individual rights. And when it was clear that these rights were being, ignored in the South with regard to the black population, it was completely legitimate for the federal government to launch a war which hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of young men died in order to free those slaves.
So
I think that's completely right.
Moving ahead 100 years,
Sure.
would you have been in the 47% of those who answered our poll who said the private sector, who said that it's not the role of government to tell the private sector that it may not discriminate on the basis of race or sex in the workplace?
So I can't remember which side of the poll is which, but I would say it is not the role of government to tell me whether I should discriminate or not. There is a difference between slavery and discrimination. Slavery is force. You guys discriminate every day. Those of you on the left, probably won't invite me home. Discrimination is what we do. Every day we choose who to talk to, who not to talk to. Now, I think it's immoral, stupid, bad business, and a whole lot of other horrible things to discriminate against a person based on the color of his skin, on his beliefs. The only issue in a workplace should be how productive are they. But people have a right to be stupid and to be irrational, even to be immoral, as long as they're not using force on another human being.
I don't want to relitigate I don't want to spend a lot of time relitigating the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but Miles?
I would just say this, that when a company or a state government or whoever it was created laws that made African Americans second-class people, or created structures in their business that paid women less than men for the same work, or forced people to work unpaid overtime, which happened for a long time as late as this afternoon, those things are not things that we should just say, well, that's up to him or her as the boss of the company to be stupid. Those are things that it is legitimate to say we ought to have laws that prevent this kind of behavior. We ought to have enforcement mechanisms that enforce fair treatment of workers. It's not just a matter of, slavery is the extreme example. But there's a long sort of slope from slavery to sharecropping, to child labor, to unsafe working conditions, etc. We ought to have a set of standards of how we think working people should be treated, and those ought to be enforced by the force of law.
I agree completely that government should not be allowed to discriminate. So anything structural within government that allowed for the discrimination pre-1964 should have been abolished, no question about that. And it's a great injustice post-Civil War that those were allowed to be sustained. Again, I differentiate between government action and individual action in that realm. But I do think there's a slippery slope towards slavery. And it is a slippery slope of force. And it is a slippery slope of coercion. And, slavery is certainly at the extreme where these people have no rights, they're completely your property, and so on. But what is it? What is it when we force some people to provide a service against their will to other people or at a price determined by some bureaucrat? It's not quite slavery, but it's certainly on that slope. So when we take a doctor and say, we have decided that you have to treat this disease and you have to treat anybody who comes to you, and this is the price you're going to get paid because we decided, then yeah, he's not quite a slave, but he's certainly on that slippery slope towards slavery.
Who've we got here? Okay, right over there. Hi.
Recently in the news, there have been a lot of conflicts between right-wing governors and the teachers and their unions. Therefore, aside from the pension and other issues, do you feel that the core of this, and this is directed to Mr. Brooke, is the fact that really those of you conservatives or right, however you want to define yourself, really don't think there's a role for public education in grades from kindergarten through 12th grade, and you would rather have vouchers, charter schools, homeschooling, parochial schools, anything other than public education?
I wish. I wish that was the issue in front of the American people. I wish that was being debated. I'm glad public education came up because I truly think it is one of the things that government should at least do. If I had to start with getting rid of government from our lives, I would probably start with public education. And I know that's shocking because it's not part of the debate, and I'm not talking about vouchers, and I'm not talking about tax credits, because those are just meant to save public education, and I'm for doing away with it. If you go back to the origins of public education, the origins of public education are in Bismarck's Germany, where the idea was to create a working class for the factories of the German Republic, and to standardize everybody, to make everybody the same, so that they could work in those factories, and that idea was imported. If you read the original people in the United States advocating for public education, they got it from those good Germans. I like to ask audiences if they were going to mail a letter, what they would do. Would they take it, and it had to get to its location, would they take it to the post office, or would they take it to FedEx or UPS? And overwhelmingly, in almost any audience, 99% of the people said they would take it to UPS or FedEx. And then ask them why it is that they're quite happy to drop their child at the post office every day for their education. Government is not equipped for many reasons to provide services. This should be done in the competitive, exciting, innovative, technologically advanced world of private enterprise. Just imagine the possibilities. I can't, because the marketplace always beats me to it. I couldn't imagine an iPad and an iPhone and all like that, but it's invented out there in the private sector. What we need, because education is so important, it's crucial. You won't find anybody who's more passionate, views education as more importantly than I do. And that's why I want it all privatized. I want the private sector to compete and to innovate and to create great products that are education. And you know what? I'm willing to give you this. If you really worry about poor kids getting an education under those terms, I'm not. I have no question they would get a far superior education than they do today, a far more varied, and there'd be many, many solutions. But if you're worried, let's sell all the schools, take all the money from the real estate we sold, put it in trust funds that give scholarships just to poor kids to attend these private schools. I also suggest there's a lot of literature around about private schools in the slums of Calcutta and the slums of Nigeria. And the idea that there are private schools among even the poorest of the poor. Parents care about their kids, they want them to get a good education, and when they're offered a private alternative, they will jump on it. So, no, I don't think the debate out there in Wisconsin is about privatizing schools, but I sure wish it was.
There's a line in an old folk song that says, if religion were a thing that money could buy, the rich would live and the poor would die. There's an analogy here. One of the great achievements of America, not from Bismarck's Germany, this was Horace Greeley in the 1830s and the 1840s, was the achievement of a public education as an equalizing, as an opportunity, as a set of opportunities that everyone could enjoy. There is an innocent... And I have to say, there is an inescapable logic in what you're saying. That if you eliminate public education, you allow everybody to fend for themselves in the private market, those people who can afford education, their kids will have a good education. Those people who cannot afford it will not. And that's not a society in which we want to live. It's not America. It's un-American, in my opinion.
I would just point out what a wonderful job public education has done equalizing those opportunities. Like most equalizing schemes, it equalizes on a very low common denominator, on the lowest common denominator. Let me add one issue about education, because it is an important topic. One of the problems when you have public education is the fundamental question of what to teach. What do you teach? Because you're not, it's public. Do you vote on what to teach? Is it a majority? And you're seeing this kind of stuff in creationism versus evolution. Now, I think you all know where I come on this issue. I'm clearly on the evolution side of this debate. But there are parents out there who really believe in creationism, and they want their kids not to study what I think is right, but what they think is right. In a private educational system, the parents would choose the school to which their kids would go, and they would get the education that the parents wanted their kids to get, rather than the education that bureaucrats decide. Now, creationism, evolution, we probably agree on. Global warming, we might not. And yet, I feel in the minority. You know, when I send my kids to kindergarten, and they were drilled with what I believe is an environmentalist religion almost, from kindergarten on about these issues. I was offended by that, and yet it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because all the schools have to be standardized because they're public. Even what you teach becomes standardized instead of, again, the variety and the richness of a truly private market and the kind of educational products it would produce.
To root some of these things into the real world of today's politics. Yaron, your bio says that your talk, Why Conservatives Are Anti-Business, challenges the common notion that conservatives are allies of business and capitalism. We've been through some things tonight that I think most of the country would consider settled law and settled belief. Child labor laws, civil rights laws, public education, even included vouchers, whether democracy is a first principle. When, say, conservatives are anti-business, is it because they just don't go far enough toward where the Rand Institute is, or why is that?
So first of all, I'd like to say you knew I was a radical before we started, so there shouldn't be too much of a surprise. I think the problem is much deeper than that, unfortunately, and the essay, I think, really elaborates on that. I believe, and I think you see this in Washington right now, I don't think there's that much difference between many of the fundamental first principle assumptions of conservatives and liberals. I think the difference between those two groups and us is dramatic. That is, I think, that most conservatives would share much of what Miles has said here today, but would argue about where to put the line. You know, how much is going to be provided. So I think that with many conservatives, not all, but many conservatives, the differences between us and them are differences of first principle. I'd love to have, another podium here with a mainstream conservative, and a lot of it has to do with, again, these ethical first principles. So I believe that conservatives approach politics from a very similar place that liberals do, in that the sense that the individual, his life, pursuing his happiness, pursuing his rational values, is not the purpose of morality. That morality is about sacrifice to the group or to some cause. It's about selflessness. It's about, it's about otherism. It's about selflessness and sacrifice. I think liberals and the Republicans share that, and I think where Rand is a real challenge. She's a real challenge to conservatives. She's a real challenge to liberals because she says, no, the purpose of morality is different. The purpose of morality is to guide you in living the best life you as an individual can live. And that dictates a whole different set of political principles that are different than the political principles that arise from a morality that says, no, your primary moral responsibility is to the group.
In your opinion, is the Tea Party coming?
I don't want people telling us how to live. I think the Tea Party represents that on an emotional level. I think what the Tea Party lacks is the intellectual foundation to make that emotion real. So they're good at enough's enough, but then ask them, what are you going to cut? What are the first principles? They fall apart. And they fall apart because their emotional response is detached from any kind of intellectual foundations. They just don't have that intellectual foundation. So in my view, it's a wonderful opportunity to educate and to help guide that movement. But I don't think they where I would like them to be, obviously.
Miles.
I guess I want to go back a little bit to the point. I guess I don't want to allow the dividing line between objectivism and liberalism to be concern for the individual, or the individual can be submerged in the collective. I believe that the best kind of liberalism or progressivism, that which Demos is engaged in, honors deeply the ability of a single individual to fulfill themselves, to to have a life with possibility, to achieve the pursuit of happiness, and to be all that they can be. We want to make sure that every single person in our society has those opportunities, not just a small group. We want to recognize, I think, the real constraints on the pursuit of happiness that exist, not just from government, but from the operations of the marketplace. And I think we want to have government and community and family play a constructive, supportive, assistive, affirmative role in allowing each individual to achieve the very best that they can achieve. I think what the consequence of the proposals that Iran is making is that some individuals who will survive as the fittest or the cleverest or the ruthlessest, I'm not sure, but some individuals will survive just fine. Many, many people will be left behind. I think that's unacceptable, but I believe that the progressivism that I support has everything to do with the individual and the ability for that individual to succeed in life and to live to the fullest.
So, Miles, how do you see the relevance, if you see a relevance, of this debate to the actual politics of the moment in Washington? Because in theory, you could have been here debating Eric Cantor or Paul Ryan or Sarah Palin, or I don't know, if we could have gotten them.
I like him better.
But they are mere conservatives. So is there a relevance to the heated enough debates that we have in D.C. today on the future of the country?
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, I'll say, and I hope I won't offend anyone from the Ayn Rand Institute, that when we first picked up this debate, some people said, why are you debating with the Ayn Rand Institute? They're all the way over here on the far right, not real representative of the conservative movement today. And I replied, and I do believe that that's not true. In fact, the fundamental principles, not all of them, but many of them, that are being articulated by the Ayn Rand Institute, by your own tonight, have in fact been picked up into the mainstream of the Republican Party today. The kinds of things that are being proposed, the kind of cuts that are being proposed, the kind of assaults on the rights of people to join unions, the kinds of things that are being done about trying to undercut public education, are straight from the fundamental set of principles that Iran very well has articulated. So yes, I think it's extremely relevant. I think that we are faced, I go back to what I said at the very beginning, with a fundamental choice of paths. My path, the path I believe that we should take, is to invest in our economy, invest in everyone, have a government with the capacity to solve the problems that we face and do so in a way that cares about individuals, or let's retreat to the rule of the free marketplace and devil take the hindmost. I think it's a mistake.
So I think that's right. I think that Ayn Rand in particular, but through our efforts over the last 25 years at the Institute as well, we have helped reshape the debate and push some in the Republican Party and some among conservatives to positions which they traditionally would not have taken. There's no question in my mind this is true of Ayn Rand. Atlas Shrugged is a book that's well read among Tea Partiers, but also among politicians. I don't think they get it, but I think it inspires them to have a little bit more confidence, a little bit more strut than they would otherwise, and to push their agenda a little bit more to the radical direction than they would otherwise. And I think that's what's saving this country, because I believe that the trouble we're in today, we both agree we're in trouble. I mean, the country's not in good position at all. But the trouble we're in today is the result of government meddling, government interference, government involvement in our economy at every single level. I can't cut down a tree in my backyard today without getting approvals from committees and so on. But it goes to that. To every aspect of our lives today is regulated, and we are suffering the consequences. I want freedom. I want Americans to be free, to experience the progress, the prosperity, but also the self-esteem that comes from achieving and from creating and from building and from innovating, that I think freedom and capitalism and getting the government out of our lives bring. I want this country to flourish and to boom. And I think it can. People talk about GDP growth of 3% or whatever GDP means. It could easily grow at double that or triple that if We were allowed to be free. There's no reason this country can't grow the way it grew in the 19th century and create the kind of opportunities and the kind of wealth that we've created in the past if we leave people free to indeed engage in those activities.
I think it is entirely possible going forward to achieve economic growth, to liberate the potential of science, of technology, of new forms of enterprise, and at the same time refusing to say, and whatever the consequences of that are on the people who are not at the very top of the totem pole are acceptable. I think we have every responsibility to say that we as a society, we as a community, are going to make sure that the fruits of that prosperity are as widely shared as possible, that the middle class, which has defined the United States in its most successful period, doesn't perish from the earth, and that we have to do affirmative work through government, as well as through the corporations, as well as through the voluntary and philanthropic sectors to try to do that. But we cannot do it if we're constantly undercutting and undermining the ability of government. I guess I would say that yes, we are in trouble. Yes, there are many, many regulations. But that the consistent rollback of them and assault on them over the last 30 years by corporations and by conservatives has made us in a much worse position than we were 30 years ago, or that we would have been had we kept on that path.
Can I just ask, before we all continue this conversation, you know, on West 4th Street and in the cafes of Bleecker Street and so on, who, raise your hand, this is an earnest question, not a sarcastic one, who has changed your mind or evolved your position through this debate this evening on anything in particular? Anybody who feels like you've come to a new understanding? And can we get a microphone to anybody who has their hand up for a brief thought? Am I seeing somebody right over there?
Hello,
okay.
Hi. I think Yaron has actually changed my view on the Civil War. I'm a states' rights kind of guy. I think you actually, and I'm more of a libertarian, but I think I kind of agree with you about the Civil War now today. I'm from the South.
Glad you said that.
Who would have expected?
Someone else?
I see that both of you gentlemen are clearly humanists, and I think both of you are looking for a better outcome. My question is that I see during the course of my lifetime incredible incompetence in government, and whether or not philosophically government should be involved or not really is not completely satisfying to me in terms of a debate. But what I do see is that governments don't know how to do what they even say they know how to do. I'm 86 years old, and I've seen a war on drugs all of my life. I can still buy any drug I want on Columbus Circle 24/7. I see the government in so many functions. I have had an opportunity to relate to several government agencies. Just totally incompetent. It's not in the nature of that mechanism to get things done at the highest level.
Okay.
And I totally agree that schools have to be...
That's not nice.
What?
Come on, let's keep it civil, everybody.
Yeah.
Somebody wants
Thank you very much. One-word answer. You're on war on drugs, yes or no?
One drugs, any one an inanimate object is not going to go well. But let me just say
war
quickly.
on drugs, yes or no?
War on drugs.
Unwinnable.
Common ground. Anybody else who's evolved tonight, seriously? Anybody else?
Right here in front.
Last call? Okay. Oh, am I missing somebody?
Yeah.
Well,
Okay,
I think that the discussions on first principles tonight really comes down to a simple philosophical question that on the surface is very simple, but is largely complex. Is humanity inherently good? I think on one side, the idea is that humanity is, in fact, inherently good. I think, Mr. Brooke, you subscribe by that belief. I think, Mr. Rappaport, that you subscribe the belief that humanity has the potential to be good and has been good in large part since our existence, but they aren't innately good, that they have the ability to do evil.
Let's finish up on that. 1 minute from each of you.
1 minute. No, I don't believe humanity is inherently good or any individual is inherently good. I believe we all have the potential for good. I think the disagreement is about what is good. I believe that what is good for the individual. I believe that morality is about living one's own life rationally to its fullest over the long term, figuring out what's good for you. And I think we all, rich and poor, and I don't know how I got cornered into protecting the rich, but somehow capitalism, that's the assumption, but I don't think it's true at all. The biggest victims, and I'll just say this, of government intervention in the economy, the biggest victims of socialism, as somebody who came from a socialist country where government intervened a lot more than here, the biggest victims are the ambitious poor, the people who could rise up under freedom, the people who want to work, who want to make something of their lives, who want to succeed, who want to prosper. They are the real victims. They're the ones we should shed tears for when we regulate, when we control, when we put them through public education, when we put them through the whole social mechanism, and we'll use welfare to institutionalize them into poverty and take away the sense of personal responsibility and personal morality that is so crucial for their development as successful, happy, prosperous human beings. If anything, objectivism should be that, rally around those people. That's who I care more about. I wasn't rich. I was an ambitious poor guy. I came to this country with nothing. Those are the people who are the real victims of state intervention and the real benefactors of freedom and capitalism.
Before Miles gets the final word of the evening, I'll just remind you that the debate on our next topic about freedom has already begun. It's afreecountry.org, haiku contest and all. We invite you to go there, and we hope to see you out here next time for that on Thursday night, April 7th. Miles, humans, good or not so good?
I believe all people are created equal with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I believe that people are, in fact, generally innately good. I believe that there are a set of structural arrangements which impact their lives in critical ways from the beginning of everyone's life. And I believe that we, as a caring society, have the responsibility and the ability, if we harness it, to create a situation in which all people, not just a few ambitious people who can succeed in any cutthroat environment, but everyone has the right and the ability and the best possible chances to succeed. We can do that, but we need to work at it.
Thank you all very much. Please thank our debaters.